Now, I have to always begin my classes by telling students why it is that I'm telling you about the subject matter that I'm telling you about. Why is it that these artists are significant? As you know, if you go to an art show today at any art center anywhere in the world, there are hundreds of artists through the year that have shown their work. But why is it in particular that only some are chosen as representational of their time and place? And this is the reason why their work stands out beyond someone else's. Now, we know that some of it has to do with luck, but another aspect of it is that you have educated, critical people that know a lot about the subject, and they come to look at artists' works, and then they see if someone has a unique voice that is representational of the spirit of their time. Therefore, what I have to do initially is always set the stage for why these things are going to happen. So about 20 or 30 of these slides are about various things that are taking place worldwide that would have had an impact on these artists that are working in Paris. And they are specifically working in Paris because Paris was the art capital of the world for 300 years. America has been the art capital of the world since 1937, when the Nazis ran over the European continent, and the artists who at that time were all either surrealist, abstract artists, cubists, and modern, were enemies of the German state. They were enemies of the German state because if you make abstract art, you have a free mind. And if you have a free mind, you are dangerous for a dictator. A dictator wants you not to think about things in your head that are possibly even going to question what he's doing as a dictator. They want you to do their will. Therefore, a lot of the artists that came to the United States at the behest of Peggy Guggenheim, and oftentimes at her cost as well, came to the United States, and the MoMA was already here and established. It was set up in 1929. So America has been the art capital of the world since that time. And it is a capital place to be. It is something that says that your culture, despite the fact that obviously our culture is so relatively new compared to many thousands of years of European culture, it says that our culture appreciates a free thinking person who is able to express themselves at will. It is representational of a democratic ideal. Another thing that we have to be very cognizant of is the role of the artist in society. Naturally, depending on what the artist's personality is like and what the artist is good at, that determines a lot of who they're going to be and how they're going to serve society. In the case of Matisse and Picasso, who became these big names at the beginning of the 20th century and remain forever as the artists that dictated many things that we see and experience in our world today, this is how fundamentally important their roles were. And we will see toward the end of the lecture, I will ask you, how many of these various roles did these two men play? Now, the way that we can begin by thinking of the changes that are taking place and the philosophical ideas that are representing a government. When we look at the work that was made at the very beginning of the 1800s, when the French Revolution was going on and when Napoleon was installed, he was making propaganda art. He was making public relations art. So naturally, he is showing us here that he is such a powerful man. Let's not forget, he's a man that controlled 3/4 of the European continent with marriages and with associations and various alliances. He is such a powerful man, though he was tiny. He was only 5'6". And as you know, a man that's 5'6" looks like he's about 5'4". He is controlling this mighty steed. But what we can see is that he is 1/4 of an inch from disaster. So Jacques-Louis David tells you a lot about what this man wants to say about himself. And then he tells you a truth about his government. It's ready to topple in 1806. Here, what you can see that is happening with the work by Ingres is he is showing us Napoleon almost as an emperor. Of course, he has all of the trappings of a Roman emperor, the wealth and everything else, but proportional to his body, his foot is tiny. And consequently, we know that he barely has a leg to stand on. Both of these works were made in 1806. So we have to ask our big question about what are the impactful changes that took place in the 1800s when between 1806 and 1906, you get a completely different style of art. This is known as classical, as a history painting, and this is a painting that is made in someone's imagination. Matisse had to not only have a wonderful imagination, but he had to understand the history of art, because he's using classical poses here that have been used for many hundreds of years. He's doing all kinds of new things with paint, and he's making something that is magical and lives in your mind, as opposed to something that is realistic and represents wealth, power, and prestige. Well, the 1800s was one shock after another. Not only do we get a message from Jane Austen, which is to say that young women can marry for love, irrespective of the fact that they may have no money, but that they have all of the good things that make a person honorable, like integrity, honesty, compassion, and all of those wonderful attributes. But one of the biggest shocks ever to hit humankind is the publication of The Origin of Species. When we were told as humankind we are very much connected to the animal kingdom, there were all kinds, obviously, of satirical cartoons that came out to insult Charles Darwin, but the art world always responds and tries in many ways to create calm in the world. The humanities are called the humanities. The liberal arts are called the humanities because their intent is humanistic. They want people to find a place in their life where art can soothe them and also teach them how to be a good human being. Well, yes.
Excuse me. We're showing this slide and the next slide. Can we just concentrate on the one slide?
It's showing two slides at a time?
The main one and the next one.
I've never had that happen before. It must be, maybe it's the way you set something up, you think?
If you click on it, maybe that'll.
Hold on. I'm going to stop share. Oh, that's a very good point you're making there. So let's see what could be the problem.
I think you just need to click on it again.
Yes. Let's see. Where is the doggone it? Where is that thing? Hold on a minute. I have to go back to Zoom. We're going to share the screen and see if this works better.
Okay. Yeah, that's it.
That's it? Wonderful. Yeah. Oh, bless your heart. Okay, wonderful. All right, so we are in a place where I can see something coming up, but you only see one. Yes? So
yes.
Cool, wonderful. Well, so how did the French Impressionists respond to this? They wanted to make a differentiation between us human beings and return us in many ways to a position of centrality by saying that human beings, though we might come from the animal kingdom, we have attributes that no animal in the world has, and that is our sophisticated mind and the impressions and the experiences that we have as human beings. What happens with the French Impressionists, say in the case of Pissarro, when he's making this kind of a rainy night representation of what he sees on the Boulevard Montmartre, is that he is trying to show us that we as humans have wonderful experiences and we take it all in, and this is almost like a Disneyland. Now, people that were writers are going to do that thing that they are the most comfortable with. And so what Dostoevsky does that is quite interesting at this time, this is almost less than 10 years after the publication of Darwinism Goes Worldwide, he writes a story about a young boy who decides on his own merits who lives or dies, which is to say, the very thing that Darwin brings up when he says survival of the fittest, or that nature chooses what lives and dies dispassionately because it's not doing it for a reason. The strong survive. So you can see that this is a story about mankind not being able to make that choice that nature would naturally make. And another big component of this story is that Dostoevsky writes a book that has never been written in this way. He writes it in stream of consciousness. He tells you what an obsessive compulsive mind does when it can't stop thinking about having committed this act in this case. Stream of consciousness has not yet been invented, but this is what he does. He gives us a look into the human mind, which is complex and can be appreciated on so many levels. One of the people, of course, that is going to bring a lot of this information forward and even give us a vocabulary with which to discuss the human mind is Freud. Freud, because of the interpretation of dreams, which will give kind of a license to drive to surrealists, because surrealist works will all be based on dreamlike states. But when he tells us that we are complex creatures that have an ego, which we show to the public, we have an animal side, and then we have a spiritual side and an unconscious aspect of our brain and so on, we begin to understand that in ancient times, when they focused on the world, they used focal point perspective or single point perspective to tell a story in which they could draw us into the work. And obviously, that's always what every artist wants you to do. They want you to walk into their work. Interesting here, you can literally skip up these steps mentally and commune with Aristotle and Plato. But as the world became more and more complex because of psychoanalysis, because of Darwinism, because of all of these new ideas, people had to change their focus. It couldn't simply be focal point perspective and just sort of one way to look at the world. What Cezanne is going to begin to do is create these kind of 2 and 3 perspectives so that he creates a flattened surface for a reason that we will find out in a moment, but he will also make the kind of paintings that look like they're floating because you can't quite get a bead on where you're supposed to look or where the focus is. This is because the world is more complex. And it's also because he has been heavily influenced by Japanism, which started in the 1830s or so. This is when the United States first and later the European world began to appreciate the drama that was in 2-dimensional works in the Japanese world, and also this high respect for the forces of nature. It is not for nothing that someone that is a post-impressionist like Van Gogh, he is using broader strokes than the French Impressionists did. He is working about 20 years after they begin. He's part of the Post-Impressionists, but what we can see is he too is very much influenced by the drama of nature. This is the reason he adds these dramatic effects beyond, of course, the personality type he has, which is so dramatic in and of itself. Well, what happens that is, again, enormously significant is Vasily Kandinsky is going to publish a work that will be translated and parts of it printed in Camera Work magazine, which is Alfred Stieglitz's publication. He is not only a man that supports photography in America, but modern art. What happens with Vasily Kandinsky, as he begins to refer to the spiritual aspect of life, he shows us examples of how the Japanese world is already very much influenced by the forces of nature, kind of in this case, very calm, floating, and these various aspects. But another thing that he talks about in this interpretation of the spirituality in art is that once the world gets very complex and people become thinkers way beyond the years before in interpreting the world, because everything, after all, after electricity, is becoming automated, and we have a telegraph, and we have so many oddities that are being added to our life, that it's not so easy to make a painting that's relevant. One of the ways that a person can make a symbolist painting at this time, like Redon, is to make representations of art that are not realistic and not necessarily representational of anything in particular, but sort of dreamlike states. Here, what we see is the Japanese world, because it's flat and doesn't use perspective the way that we did for so many hundreds of years, they use color blocks and expression and the posture of the body to tell the story, because they make art in a different way, but they want to convey a bigger story in one image. This is going to translate into French art. This will become known as the Art Nouveau period. 1890 to 1914, it will begin to be very much flattened. And as you know, modern art throughout the 20th century was significantly flat because it represented things that are not necessarily something you would see in a realistic world. Another thing we have to know, because Matisse was a major colorist, he became known as one of the greatest colorists of all time, and he made good use of Chevreul's color wheel and color theories. So that you can see when Kandinsky is even doing these kind of experiments, he's doing it on the basis of the theories that are being postulated by Chevreul, which tell us that colors have inherent qualities, in the sense that we are blue when we're depressed, we're yellow when we're sunny and upbeat, or we are green with envy. So we know that colors in and of themselves have those kind of qualities, but we have to understand how contrasting them makes the picture pop. Well, here we go. Here's Matisse as an adorable young man, and he had some kind of physical illness around the time that he was in his early 20s, perhaps, and he was attending law school, so he remained at home. His mother bought him a palette and some colors to work with so that he could paint whatever, because he was so bored in bed. But as it happens, he already came from this northern, central, eastern part of France. And this part of the country was well known for beautiful embroidered works. Matisse's ancestors lived here for hundreds of years. Their work was known in the fabric industry, and they were always known for their excellence. In addition to that, there was another symbolist painter that was influencing Matisse, because as you know, every art movement will influence the next art movement, because the next art movement is not only tipping its hat to the one previously, but they oftentimes show you that they have a connection with all of the other movements all the way to Greece. In any case, Gustave Moreau is one of these symbolist painters that makes these superlative decorative interiors. And he was a man that here showing us Oedipus Rex and the Sphinx, and he's going to answer the riddle of the Sphinx. Well, there was a great deal of interest in classicism at this moment as well, probably because Lord Elgin had brought the Parthenon marbles to London, and they were on exhibition in the Tate. I guess maybe it was the Tate at that time, maybe it was Albert Museum, I'm not sure, but everybody would have known about it and they would have gone to Paris to see it. So this interest in classicism is one of the reasons why we see these kind of works. But Moreau was a man that absolutely loved interior design, and we see that in all his work. Well, Matisse had a significant moment in his life when he was able to go to Morocco. And as I've heard from almost anyone that has ever been there, they fall madly in love with Morocco. Not just the colors and the way the sun hits the stones at the edge of the waterways, but the blues and the very, very bright colors and patterns. This is why in the future you will see Matisse using these kind of complex interiors that he's already adopted from the artist that we saw here a moment ago, Gustave Moreau, and he is making use of, you can see oftentimes, of the odalisque, which is the harem kind of pictures that were popular at this time because of history paintings making those kind of works. Now, in terms of understanding color, so no one can really touch Matisse in this 50-year period or so, beginning of the 1900s, 1950s or so, until we start to get American abstract expressionists. Picasso, Matisse absolutely absorb everyone's energy. Well, we can see what is going on here. He is using a lot of those ideas from Chevreul to make this pop, but he is in addition using these swaths of color, these kind of big spaces of dramatic color, and he's contrasting it so it will pop, and it's very flat, and it's original and very different. This is something that he did around 1908. But prior to that time, he was studying interiors, in particular, some of the Rococo and Dutch interiors, which were typically made in these kind of umber tones. But what happens with Matisse, because he's mad for color, and by the way, he said more often than not in this kind of complex work, because there's so much going on, he would introduce into the picture black and white to give your place, your eyes a place to rest. I don't know about you, I'm still not resting. But the point is, of course, that he's doing something that's different that no one has really seen. This is 1911. But he is basing it on motifs that are well known. This is the Dutch master, Baroque era, Jan Steen, shows you a picture in umber tones of the very way you should not run a household. This is why we see so many aspects of Matisse's work at the very beginning that tend to have these kind of brown tones. Additionally, he never went to a proper art school. So one of the ways that he's going to train himself is by, on the one hand, being interested in manipulating various shades of brown, because something like this is most difficult to do if you don't know what you're doing. If you're using various shades of brown to make this look interesting is a job. And here again, the sunlight that is bringing this room to life has this additional quality of those umber tones. But Matisse became more and more interested in the Impressionist and Post-Impressionist. And consequently, he went to the man that helped absolutely everyone, and his name was Camille Pissarro. Camille Pissarro was the uncle to any artist that wanted to learn about what it is that the French Impressionists were doing. And the French Impressionists, by the time that Matisse came along, were enormously successful and had sold tons of their work. So it was no skin off their nose to help other artists. They weren't going to be competition. But what happens with Camille Pissarro is he introduces Matisse to the pointillist Georges Seurat and Paul Signac. And what happens at this point is that Matisse says to him, you know, if you want your work to come alive, look at the works of these other artists, and you can and study their techniques and see what they're doing and see if you have a response to it. Because this work, by the way, is already being made by Matisse as he is practicing his pointillist style. In addition to that, Pissarro introduces him to the world of William Turner. And William Turner used the weather to convey with these dramatic strokes his feelings as he's looking at this, and also just generally his internal feelings, even in the 1840s. This is the reason that the French Impressionists will begin to adopt these kind of dramatic brushstrokes. They will see it from Turner. Still in all, what happens is we are living in the era of Cezanne. Cezanne with Pissarro and others who lived a long time, like Degas, not only did they work in the Impressionist style, but then they worked in the Post-Impressionist style. And the Post-Impressionist style was different in that you can see here it's very flattened. And if you look at the work here that we see, he is using focal point perspective. So that's one of the big differences. The big differences is Impressionist painters were painting outdoor scenes that looked like the real world looked. And Post-Impressionists were making more flattened images that were playing with perspective, but were also recognizable as to what they were painting. The subject matter was definitely recognizable. So here are some of the experiments that Matisse is going to do under the tutelage of Pissarro when he is conveying his interest in wanting to learn about what others have done and what he could potentially bring to the table, no pun intended, what he can bring to the table as an artist that will start a movement that will be a little bit different than this one, so that another chapter can be added to the history of art. Well, let's look at Picasso. Picasso here was a powerful little kid. As I said, with Napoleon was 5'6", and most men, to me, that measure 5'6", I'm 5'6", I have a brother that measures 5'8". He and I are exactly, he's my twin. We are exactly the same height. He measures 5'8", I measure 5'6". Don't ask me why. What happens here is Picasso at in his full adult height is going to be 5'2". He's going to be a tiny man with a huge personality. And his mother knew, he had black eyes, by the way, black eyes and black hair. It's not every day that you see someone with black eyes. It is intense. And the contrast between the black and the white in the eye was something unbelievable. The mother said, and these are portraits of his parents that he makes at the age of 15. His mother said, she knew that by the time that he was 4 or 5 years old, that if he went into the military, he would become a 4-star general. If he went to the church, and become part of the church hierarchy, he would become the Pope. His mother's name, by the way, is Ruiz, which is the same as Smith in the United States. So he is going to take the father's name, was Ruiz. And the mother's name is Picasso. So he's going to take the name Picasso because it's a more elegant name. And he's not your everyday chap. And let's say that this mother's premonition that no matter what he went into in future years, she said, as he became an artist and did not go in the military, he did not go in the church, he had to become Picasso. And he did. Oh, did he ever, because his father was an art teacher and later professor. The father took the family, they were born in Malaga, which is absolutely nowheresville, which is where Picasso was born. And the father knew that his son was so enormously talented that by the time that Picasso was just 12 years old, he already knew everything his father could teach him. Well, the father is so impressed with him that by the time he's 15, 16, he moves the family to Barcelona, where there's a bigger school and where he will get instruction from other people. This is the kind of work that Picasso makes at the age of 15 to be invited into the premier school there. And of course, the critics went absolutely nuts for his work, because what are they going to say about this young man? It's astonishing, the excellent use of spatial depth, how he takes you into his work. Every artist wants to take you into his work and help you look around at everything so you don't miss anything. The remarkable mastery of painting techniques to make this kind of light veil-like material and to be able to paint it in this a very difficult thing to do. And these kind of reds, how rich they are, how the fabric and everything is brought to life in a way that is absolutely amazing. Carefully composed, complex human relationships. His sister Lola is here as the model, reading her Bible in this confirmation, I'm assuming. The father is also reading the book. The little boy is looking at the book. And then one of his aunts, who is a model, is looking here. And what is she looking at? Well, we find out later that there are 4 candles, but only 2 are lit because Picasso's mother gave birth to 4 children and 2 of them did not even reach the age of 2. Extremely mature work. But this is just the beginning, because some of his best work is in the beginning of his life. And then he will be experimental and do extraordinary things. But now he is tugging at your heartstrings. His sister Lola is in bed sick. His father is sitting there taking her pulse. And we already know by all the symbols here, right? Because a painting like this is a novel in one shot. When you see many generations in a room, you're comfortable with it because that's how your life looks. There are generations collected together as family. He uses every trick of the book to get you into the painting. He leaves a space here for you to mentally walk into the painting. And the bed is not straight because maybe when you come visit this young woman, you will straighten her bed. It's one of the few things you can do for her. She is ill, so much so, and of course, this is the foreboding dark door that is behind the doctor that tells us what he's thinking, what he knows. She is near death, so much so that her hand is already discolored. But what told his father that this young boy was a genius beyond his years is the watermarks under the window. Because this tells us that she lives in a room that's cold and damp, about the worst thing that is good for the body. That's badly said. It is about the worst thing that you can do if you want to get well. Well, by the time he was 19 years old, when he made this work, and he again is inviting you into his work. This is a technique that's used over and over and over again. There's a chair here for you. This chair is meant for you. You're supposed to pull it out and sit here and enjoy all of these lovely things that are on the table. But he tells you, though he is using blocks of color because of Art Nouveau, the Japanese influence, he is also creating this wonderful atmosphere here. And he tells you what he thinks about these women, because this is now the Moulin de la Galette at night. In the day, it's a place where children and families go and buy their little galettes, their little, their lovely pastries to eat. But at night, it turns into a haunt where women come here to pay their way through life, as it were, because they haven't enough money. So these ladies who make their living on their back are shown here in a grotesque way. He is going to show this work in the 1900s World Exposition that is going to take place in Paris, and this is where he's going to meet the Stein family. They will forever be enamored with him, because he and his work is going to be sent and set up in the Spanish Pavilion as an up-and-coming young artist. So the Stein family, who is going to make his future, understands what he can do if he wants to make a painting that's realistic. But that is precisely not what he wants to do. He is a man that is going to be a big risk taker. Now, before the family comes back to Paris to live, because they will go back home and sort their life out in America and later move to Paris, he will initially be very full of himself. This painting is known as Yo Picasso. I am Picasso. Don't forget it. Here you can see what happens just 18 months later. He's cold, he's hungry, and living in a dump, and he's sharing it with critters you don't even want to think about. By the time that the Stein family comes back around 1905 or so, they are here because Gertrude has had a love affair at Radcliffe that didn't go well. She's depressed. I take it back. Yeah, Radcliffe, she had a love affair that failed, but she also went to Johns Hopkins Medical School for 3 years. And she had another love affair there that didn't work out. So she didn't finish medical school. Some say she flunked out. Who knows? She went there. She went for Radcliffe 4 years, Johns Hopkins for 3. And Leo is a Harvard man, and Michael is a Harvard man, and his wife is a socialite from San Francisco area. The au pair and the son of this couple set up their homes in Paris, and they go to a man who is considered to be one of the premier critics and experts on art that lives in Italy. And he says to them, if you all want to be part of the art world, buy and sell art, blah, 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 write about it, because all of them were intellectuals. Absolutely all of them were intellectuals that were very much interested in art and wanted to make their life around it. He said to them, if you can buy French Impressionist or Post-Impressionist works, do it immediately, because they're shooting up in price, and some of the pieces you will not be able to buy at all. You will not be able to afford it. Now, as it happens, this family is living on a trust fund, and there are 2 more siblings that live in Baltimore. So Michael is the oldest brother, and he pays the taxes and he collects rents and, all kinds of things that are being done in the United States in the Oakland, San Francisco area. He is sort of managing it through his right-hand man there. But after they pay taxes in the United States, it has to be split 5 ways. So they didn't have enormous amounts of money. But one of the things that was a positive thing was that the French franc was 10 to 1 American dollar. Still in all, what happens is the 4 of them go on a spending spree. They buy 2 Gauguins, which have just now arrived from Tahiti in 1906. They buy the only Cezanne they can get their hand on, and they buy sort of a throwaway tiny little picture that Renoir made of the nursemaid and his son, Jean. when he's a little boy. And they're out of money until next tax season. So they decided, why on earth, since they are the aesthetes that they are, and that they so appreciate art themselves, why can't they go to art shows that are taking place, these free art shows all over Paris? And in particular, there was one very significant show, say, where somebody like Renoir or Camille Claudel would have exhibited their work. So we're talking about top-notch artists. There was the Autumnal Salon where people went to meet some of the greats and some of the new people. Gertrude and Leo went to this autumnal show, and so did the other brother and sister-in-law, and they fell in love with Picasso because they had already met him, if you remember. And consequently, they know that he's a person that can do much more than what he's doing here. Clearly, he's doing some kind of experiments because they already saw his work. And he conveys to them that he's making studies of volume. He's also making these works in neutral tones because he hardly has enough money. He's living in the Bateau Lavoir, and he hardly has enough money to buy different colors of paint. In addition, they buy yet another piece of Picasso's, and they buy a Bonnard and some ancillary people that have lesser names but become known in the 20th century. So here's what you see. Bonnard's work of this nude, which is a very typical painting of nudes, and Picasso. Sarah and Michael live in another apartment, and this has been photoshopped to show you which pieces they own. So clearly they are buying Picasso and they're buying Matisse as well. Now Matisse, after he does these volume studies, so you can see what happens here, which is quite interesting in the art world. Artists communicate with each other so that they can essentially say, I see what you're doing. Here's my take on it. Perhaps I can do better. Picasso is living in that area of Paris where a lot of the circus people live, because if you're very impoverished and you live in caravans, etc., it's the only place to park these big caravans, horses, and so on. So he starts to paint the people of the streets. That's what Picasso is doing at this juncture. And Matisse is doing the volume studies. Another thing that Matisse is doing based on the work of the pointillists is he's broadening his stroke, and he's becoming very fixed with André Derain, who we see here. Who's making his self-portraits. Derain is making these portraits, and he's also made this portrait of Matisse. The two of them go to Collioure, which is in, I believe, in the southern part of France. They go there to kind of to the beach side, and they are making these kind of images, which clearly you can see are going to lead to abstract art and Kandinsky. Because though they began as pointillists, we can see the kind of experimentation that they're doing is beginning to represent a world that is not realistic. And in fact, Vasily Kandinsky will write about this in what we saw not too long ago, The Spiritual in Art. Of all the arts, abstract painting is the most difficult. It demands that you know how to draw well, that you have a heightened sensitivity for composition and for color, and that you be a true poet. This last is essential. What will happen with Gertrude and Picasso is he will have a relatively minimal education. He will have a great art education, but he will not be worldly in the way that Gertrude Stein will be. She will be among intellectuals her whole life because she's got two other brothers who are super bright. She's super bright, and they all want to tell you how bright they are. So what they begin to do is they begin to have the first modern art gallery in their homes. Gertrude, because she and Leo don't have children and are not married, they can have people come to their home day or night, or in the evening, in the afternoon, whenever. Whereas the other Steins would typically have someone over for a meal because they have a child to look after. Well, what happens at this time, 1907, is right around the time that Cezanne will pass away. And Cezanne will become the Lord and Master. He will become the Alpha and Omega of all modern artists because of his experiments. So though he painted Mont Sainte-Victoire over 70 times because he could see it outside his window, you can see what happens here as his work becomes so unrealistic and fractured. This is the last work that he was making of the same mountain. He will actually become the father of Cubism. But this honor that goes to Cezanne will show up in almost everyone's work around different times in the 20th century. He will paint, Cezanne is going to paint his wife with this kind of greenish face. So whenever you see a green face after this moment, which is around 1890 something, after this, you will see green faces and these kind of images that are always saying Cezanne is the master. Well, here we see a picture of Matisse at the home of Sarah and Michael Stein and their little boy. They've gone to this autumnal salon in 1905, and they have purchased this painting, one of two paintings that Matisse was showing at this time, and the critics were so abhorred and offended by these works that they began to refer to Derain, Matisse, and de Vlaminck as the fauves, the wild beasts. What we see that is happening, which is not so easy to see if you are not an art aficionado, or you don't know this man personally, or he's not written about in journals yet, is that he is a colorist that is doing experiments, and he is bent on doing things that are not realistic for a specific purpose. Gertrude and Leo bought this work. Michael and Sarah bought that work, which we saw here, hanging on their wall. And they knew, because they come from a business background, that infamy is more important than fame. Therefore, they're going to get a lot of attention, and they're going to position themselves as people that appreciate new ideas. And after all, isn't art a representation of the life and times in which it's made? Paris was the center of experiments for everything imaginable at this time. It was physics with the Curies. It was medical research with the big veterans hospital that had been built by Bonaparte. All of these things that were going on here were representational in their art forms. But what happened with Matisse and Picasso, because they had absolutely no one else buying their work, was that they were vying for the love of the Stein family to continue to buy their work. That's why when Matisse does their portraits and Picasso does their portraits, they're doing it to thank them because they are saving them from a life of misery. Who is going to buy their art if, by the way, Mrs. Matisse, you might notice she's a little bit miserable, as she was never much happier than this anyway, because her husband was training to be an attorney and he turned out to be an artist. Wonderful. Well, now what we begin to understand, and why you must support artists that maybe are not bringing their work to full fruition initially, because when we see this work done kind of in this phase, and he's still doing his kind of broad strokes a la pointillist and expanding them, he's going to refine it with this work. And this is the landscape that he was looking at. This is approximately where he was positioned again in Collioure. So what is he doing here that is so significant? As we said at the very beginning, What he is doing is making these blocks of color experiments. He's also using very traditional poses. This is known as the butterfly pose, in which a woman lifts her arms up over her head and puts her hands behind her neckline, sort of, because this makes her body look more youthful, tall. Her breasts are lifted, so the whole physique looks more enticing and just beautiful, I would say. It just looks beautiful because the shapes are so divine. All of these various ways that he does this, and the dance eventually will become a major subject of his, as you probably know. He is including in this work his take as a modern man of a subject that has been around and that has been painted for thousands of years, the Bacchanal. It was either painted or it was in mosaic, or it was certainly in theater, all of this. So what is the Bacchanal? They're doing the May dance here. And this is a celebration of life. You're celebrating it in honor of the god Bacchus, or Dionysus in Greek. And this is a day where people have, frankly, orgies outside. They drink, they make merry. And what he's doing is taking a subject that has been painted. You can find 100 paintings of bacchanals if you just put that into the Google search engine. Completely new. Because he's doing this completely new, then Gauguin is doing something very, very similar, in the same way that we see even Vincent van Gogh: flatness, color blocks, Orientalism, etc. But what happens with Picasso when he becomes friends with Gertrude and Leo Stein, and of course the other Stein family as well, is that he is introduced to the concepts that he would not have known so much about. He was still a very young man in his 20s or so, and Matisse at this point is about 35. When they're talking about this discussion of human emotions, etc., the value of color, blah, 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 then we can see what he's doing here. He's showing us kind of this dejected way that someone would hold their head, the angles of the bodies, the sharpness of all this tells you the suffering of people, the hardships that people live through because they are his neighbors. This was labeled the blue period. So naturally, Henri Matisse has to answer. This is his blue nude. But we know that Matisse is far closer to classicism and to the classical world in general. So we see what he's doing. It's essentially a play on the tomb of Giuliano de' Medici. And if we see it much closer, we can see that there is connection to what is going to be hanging in Gertrude Stein's living room. The blue nude and the joy of life, which will later go to the Barnes Museum. Dr. Barnes is going to be one of the people that is going to come here to the Saturday night salon, where a lot of impoverished artists are going to come here, and it'll probably be the only good meal that they're going to get that week. Now, this picture is a representation of a bacchanal. Since Picasso and Matisse are in this desperate rivalry to outdo each other, what will happen with Picasso is he will make a picture of the history of art from the very beginning. He's not just going to use one painting to make a representation in a modern way. He's already working on Cubism, but this piece will actually be in his studio for a long time before he shows it to anyone, because he's afraid that people will be insulting toward him. Well, what is in this work that makes it such an extraordinary piece of art? Because it will be the foundation for 20th century art. It includes in it all of these aspects of Western civilization: Cycladic art from the Greek islands and the Aegean Sea. It's the stories, the backs, and so on, and women in these harems in the Turkish world that were so popular as painting subjects at this time. We see the Egyptian eye and the side profile, the elongation that is done by Modigliani. Here, if you remember, we're seeing kind of this butterfly pose in this kind of classical work that is from the Rococo era. We see it even here in these kind of cubes that Cezanne did. He too is using these kind of traditional motifs of the backs and the elongated body and the African masks. This is precisely what we are looking at when we see this work. And something else that I noticed that really blew my mind was that I noticed not too long ago that this woman was holding the curtain back. And I thought, why on earth would she be holding the curtain back? And then I went to the Ringling to do a tour, and voila, these little angels are holding the curtain back to tell this biblical story on a stage. What we have is Picasso creating a stage set for us. He throws in a still life, but it is, after all, a brothel. So you better be careful where you eat. You might nick your mouth or worse. Well, why on earth would you think that Abby Aldrich Rockefeller waited for 10 solid years until she could bring this work to the MoMA? Everyone that comes to the MoMA, they make a beeline for this work. Look how big it is. It's about 7.5 feet by 7.5 feet. It is the beginning of modern art because it is in no way realistic and it is in every way historical. So what it is a celebration of human creativity. Take that, Darwin. What other animal on earth could come up with something so clever and creative? Well, since Gertrude Stein and Picasso are very close friends, and because she is constantly talking to him about the theories not only of the subconscious mind, but she's also telling him about stream of consciousness, the coined phrase that was developed by her professor at Radcliffe, William James. What happens with Picasso and Braque is they begin to develop Cubism even further. And when they do, Gertrude Stein decides to write a Cubist poem about her friend Rose. As if her eyes, as you see, these are kind of tables that you would see in any French bistro. They're oftentimes these kind of shimmery colors that have a very strong lacquer finish on them. And if you look closely, you'll see newspapers and you'll see cigars and you'll see various things on the table as their eye is fluttering around the table. This is what Gertrude Stein writes about her friend as she is looking at the milieu in which her friend is sitting in the garden. Rose is a rose, is a rose, is a rose. Loveliness extreme, extra gators, loveliness extreme, sweetest ice cream, pages, ages, page, ages, page, ages. She was very much interested in writing in the stream of consciousness style, which will come to its full fruition in James Joyce Ulysses. We can discuss that some other time. But what will happen with Gertrude Stein and why she will help in many ways promote the future American art scene, which we will not know about yet. In 1913, the Armory building in New York was set up like gallery spaces, and American art was shown first, and then European art, and 1,200 pieces of works were on exhibition here. And one of the people that was overseeing this with many others that were part of this 1913 show, which I have a lecture on just it's amazing that there are 3 lectures on the 1913 show because it was such a significant moment in history. Stieglitz, as we know, is very much pro-abstract art because he published Kandinsky's part of his work in Camera Work magazine. But he also wants America to be a center, not only for photography, but he supports a gallery called 291 Fifth Avenue, where he's promoting his photography, other photographers, and modern art. He wants Americans to appreciate art because we are seen as a backwards nation that has no appreciation for culture. We have a lot of impoverished immigrants, et cetera, et cetera. So what happened at this point is when this show actually happens, and it costs $5, which is the equivalent today of more, maybe $120. It costs $5 to go into the show. It was up for a month and you could go in as much as you want. Naturally, it was derided by every cartoonist, by every a critic, everyone imaginable. They made postcards to sell because they knew people would want to have a memento of the horror that they had just seen. And it was one way that they could prove that they had been to this insane show, which was put on this Cubist exhibit, which started a riot, according to some newspapers. The portrait of a lady by Gyp the Futurist, works by nuttest, dopest, topsy-turviest, inside-outest, and doodlest, which police are trying to locate. And the old masters, you can see, are jumping off the walls of the Metropolitan in horror. Well, it's good to be infamous, because what happens is people are so shocked. The Metropolitan Museum refuses to show even French Impressionist artwork because that's too new for them, even 1913. This went on until the 1950s, by the way. The Met refused to show any kind of modern art. So people didn't have a segue where they showed Picasso's Cubist works. It was called the Chamber of Horrors because this was even more insulting than the works of Matisse, because at least you could recognize something here and what in the world is going on here. To insult Picasso even further, who in their wildest dreams, particularly these people that are so well turned out, oh my God, the man is wearing tails, a top hat and tails, and who would dare to put their elbow on the pedestal next to a precious piece of sculpture? So this is how it was derided everywhere. The other very large piece that was on exhibition was this Red Room, which sold in 1913 for $40,000, which is today close to $1 million. Someone purchased it. Well, so this is what an artist studio is. Everybody wants to know. I must be a monkey's uncle, because if I want to know what an artist studio looks, it should probably look more like this, or perhaps it should look like this, but it certainly shouldn't look like that. But you see, Matisse is going to have a profound impact on the interiors of homes. Matisse, his colors, his patterns, his unique way to put everything together is going to be the way many of us, if we're lucky enough to live this way. This is going to become a unique kind of style, and many people will ascribe to it. It looks a little bit like a harem, but at the same time, it's something interesting, mixing patterns. This is what we do all the time. This interest in kind of the interiors that he's creating here, and the fashion world, when they design fabrics and so on, have a great deal to say about their appreciation for Matisse. Now, when we get to Picasso, we know we are in a different land. Because one thing is, Picasso was a wild man. He wasn't a very kind man. He was all for himself, egocentric. And what you can see is the kind of the way that he destroys women, in particular when he's finished with them, in the case, as you can see here and in others. Matisse is a civilized human being. And on top of that, what we can see is that one of the reasons that Picasso in many ways supersedes Matisse is that he takes a lot of risks. But we all know that the personality is on view here. That this is the personality of a man who loves women, and this is the personality of a man that likes women for maybe one or two things, primarily one. But in addition to kind of the contrasts when you make here, the creativity on the side of Picasso is so extraordinary that it's difficult to compare the two. They just live in different realms. In the case of Picasso and Braque, the 20th century was in large part a response to Cubism, whether it was Piet Mondrian or Kazimir Malevich or Frank Lloyd Wright with his interiors and volumes. And one thing that we can see very clearly is the Weizmann Museum of Art, which is located in Minnesota, is the first time that Frank Gehry begins to bring three-dimensional cubism to life. And then he expands on it at the Bilbao Museum. What I was gratified to see and quite surprised when I was there is that even the sandstone that was chosen here is in different colors because it's mimicking that. So what we have is the kind of way that art can be parlayed in so many, many ways. No one thought that Cubism would have any application whatsoever, but Gertrude Stein did. And her brothers and sister-in-law turned against Picasso after Cubism. She was the only one that remained faithful to him because she understood he was doing something that was a celebration of the qualities of the brain, of the mind, of the imagination. If I have to convince you that these three people were forces of nature, I certainly can convince you that this woman was, because there were equally good artists at this time. There were just as many artists. When we go to shows every day of the week, we can go to a show. We can see people that do imaginative, clever things, but they are not the ones that we talk about. We don't talk about Felix Vallotton. Why? I don't know. I love this. It's mysterious. It's elegant. It's interesting. It's dreamlike. It has an interesting story, etc., etc. This is Vallotton's work. Not so much different. In fact, might be even better than Matisse. But he is not the man that we talk about. He's not the man that we talk about. This is Vallotton as well, who also made a portrait of Gertrude Stein. But we talk about Picasso. Not for nothing is Gertrude Stein's portrait at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. She was probably one of the most important people of the 20th century because she liberated the arts. So now let's look at this and decide, what roles did these artists play in society? Well, definitely risk takers, definitely radical, definitely pioneered a new way. Also documented the era. They were oftentimes humorous. They certainly informed us of a new way of looking at things. They were certainly reformers that wanted us to go just beyond realism. They advocated for the creative mind. They dreamed about a different chapter in art. They certainly were thinkers, and they were certainly visionaries. And without question, excellent storytellers.